At 0612 local time on February 2, 2026, an American F-35E pilot assigned to a classified joint U.S.-Israeli package was already 40 nautical miles into Iranian airspace and descending fast. The mission briefing had called this the most complex coordinated strike in the history of modern aerial warfare. Not because of the target's defenses, which were formidable, not because of the distance, which was extraordinary, but because of what the target represented. At the center of the strike package's objective matrix, buried inside an intelligence assessment that had taken 14 months to build, was a single name: Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The operational window was 11 minutes. The consequences of failure were incalculable, and the pilot was about to find out whether American air power, Israeli intelligence, and French-designed precision munitions could do what no military force on Earth had ever attempted at this scale. He's about to find out at 950 kilometers per hour, 60 meters above the desert floor. The approach had been war-gamed 47 times in simulation before a single aircraft left the ground. Joint U.S.-Israeli planners at a class facility outside Tel Aviv had spent 6 weeks building the threat model for this corridor. Iranian air defense had been modernized significantly since 2023, incorporating Russian-supplied S-400 components, domestically produced Bavard-73 batteries, and a network of Gadir over the horizon that could theoretically detect stealth aircraft under certain atmospheric conditions. Theoretically, the F-35's radar cross-section was the size of a golf ball to most radar systems. To some of the newer Iranian installations, it was slightly larger than that. The mission planners had called the corridor survivable. They had been careful with their language. Survivable was not the same as safe. The pilot understood the distinction completely. Flying in trail formation 8 kilometers behind him was a second F-35E carrying a different weapons load and a different mission assignment. Together they formed the tip of a strike package that stretched across 200 kilometers of airspace, a layered architecture of electronic warfare aircraft, suppression of enemy air defense platforms, and tankers that had been pre-positioned over the Gulf with enough fuel to keep this operation running for 6 hours. The USS Abraham Lincoln had turned into the wind 90 minutes earlier. Its flight deck was active with a continuous cycle of E-8AG growlers launching to jam Iranian radar frequencies along the strike corridor's northern edge. American electronic warfare dominance had been total and deliberate for the past 45 minutes. Every radar system in a 300-kilometer arc around the primary target had been experiencing intermittent interference that Iranian operators were still trying to diagnose. They didn't know it was deliberate. They thought it was a solar event. That was by design. The intelligence that had built this mission had come from sources that would never be publicly acknowledged. 14 months of overhead imagery, signals intelligence collection, human intelligence from networks inside Iran that had been cultivated for years by both the CIA and Mossad, and a significant breakthrough in late November 2025 when a source with direct access to the Iranian Supreme National Security Council passed coordinates and a schedule that had been verified 6 times before anyone with decision-making authority was briefed. The Supreme Leader's movements had become increasingly unpredictable since 2024, a deliberate security adaptation following the elimination of several senior IRGC commanders in precision strikes attributed to Israel. He had stopped using fixed residences. He had stopped relying on electronic communications that could be intercepted. His security detail had grown from 200 personnel to over 800, a protective layer that moved with him constantly, a small army built around one man. But the one thing that hadn't changed was the monthly coordination meeting with senior IRGC commanders that Khamenei conducted personally. It was the one event his security apparatus couldn't eliminate without crippling the command structure of the Iranian military, and on February 2, 2026, that meeting was scheduled to take place in a hardened command facility 40 meters below the surface of a compound outside Natanz. The intelligence said the meeting would begin at 0600 local time. The intelligence said it would last approximately 90 minutes. The intelligence said the facility's blast-resistant construction had been designed to withstand conventional munitions. It had not been designed to withstand what the Americans and Israelis had spent the last 8 months building specifically for this purpose. The pilot's radar warning receiver triggered at 014, a single sharp tone that didn't match any of the threat profiles his electronic warfare suite had been briefed on. Not the familiar pulse of an SA-20 acquisition radar, not the distinctive warble of a MM2 fire control system. Something new. Something that the 14 months of intelligence preparation had not captured. His threat library was one of the most comprehensive databases of hostile radar emissions ever compiled, updated 72 hours before launch with the latest signals intelligence from NSA collection platforms. Whatever was pinging his aircraft wasn't in it. In 23 years of flying, the pilot had never encountered an emission signature he couldn't classify. His hands tightened on the stick as his brain brain processed the implications. Iran had a new system, and it had found him. The evasive sequence he executed over the next 11 seconds had been rehearsed so many times it bypassed conscious thought entirely. Stick right, 30 degrees of bank, dropping 20 meters of altitude, while dispensing a programmed sequence of radio frequency decoys designed to create false targets in the acquisition buffer of whatever system was tracking him. The tone continued for 4 seconds, and then stopped. He didn't know if the decoys had worked, or if the system had simply lost him in ground clutter. Either way, he was still flying, and the mission clock was still running, and the target was still 28 kilometers ahead. He keyed his data link and flagged the emission, the electronic warfare aircraft orbiting to his north. Within 90 seconds, 3 EA-18G Growlers had redirected their jamming energy toward the frequency band where the new emission had appeared. The Americans would spend months analyzing what they'd encountered. Right now, all that mattered was that it had stopped. The strike package's electronic architecture was the most sophisticated ever assembled for a single mission. American investment in electromagnetic spectrum dominance had accelerated dramatically following the lessons of the Ukraine conflict, where Russian electronic warfare capabilities had demonstrated that GPS-guided munitions could be degraded, communication networks could be disrupted, and our invisible aircraft could sometimes be found through creative exploitation of secondary emissions. The Pentagon had responded with a generation of countermeasures that made the systems of 22 look primitive. The EA-18G's jamming pods had been upgraded twice since 2023. The F-35's electronic warfare suite had received a software update in December 2025 that specifically addressed lessons learned from Iranian air defense modernization. The Americans had been studying this problem for a long time. They had not been surprised by the S-400 components. They had been surprised by the new emission signature, but they had the architecture to respond to surprises, and that architecture was already working. 22 kilometers ahead, the compound outside Natanz was quiet on the surface. Israeli overhead imagery from a satellite pass 40 minutes earlier had shown normal security patterns, vehicle traffic consistent with a senior command meeting in progress, thermal signatures from the facility's ventilation system indicating occupancy in the deep underground levels. The intelligence picture was holding. The meeting was happening. The window was open. The pilot checked his weapons status, confirmed his release parameters, and pushed the throttle slightly forward as the desert floor blurred beneath him in the gray morning light. What the Iranians had done with their air defense network since 2020-24 reflected hard lessons learned from watching the destruction of Russian and Syrian air defense systems by American and Israeli precision strikes over the preceding years. They had dispersed their high-value radar systems, moving them frequently and unpredictably. They had buried fiber optic communication links connecting their command nodes, eliminating the radio frequency emissions that American signals intelligence could track. They had acquired a limited number of systems from China that incorporated passive detection technology, systems that emitted nothing themselves but listened for the electromagnetic noise that even stealth aircraft inevitably produced. The new emission signature the pilot had detected wasn't a radar at all. It was a data link from a passive detection array that had picked up the heat signature of his engines against the cold desert sky, was transmitting targeting data to a missile battery 40 kilometers to the south. The Iranians had learned from watching drones in Ukraine. They had adapted the concept, an entirely passive kill chain from detection to targeting that generated almost no radar emissions for the F-35's threat library to classify. The missile launch warning came 4 seconds later. His tail approach warning system detected the rocket motor plume of a Sayyad 4B accelerating off its launch rail somewhere in the desert behind him. Mach 4 closure rate, estimated intercept seconds. The pilot was already moving. He had thought about this moment many times in the 6 weeks of preparation, and the conclusion he had reached every time was the same. At this altitude, at this speed, there was only one option. He pushed the throttle into full afterburner and pulled the stick back hard, trading terrain masking for pure kinematic performance, climbing at 60 degrees and dispensing a continuous stream of infrared countermeasures as his altitude unwound upward at 300 meters per second. Behind him, the Sayyad Seeker was chasing the brightest infrared source, in its view. The afterburner plume was an extraordinary heat source. The infrared countermeasures were engineered to mimic it. The missile's guidance computer was running a discrimination algorithm designed to distinguish aircraft engines from decoys. Algorithm. American defense contractors had spent considerable money understanding it. The countermeasures had been specifically optimized to defeat it. The Sayyad detonated 180 meters behind him. The proximity fuse did its job, and the warhead fragmented in a sphere of high-velocity steel. Several fragments struck the F-35's aft fuselage. The aircraft shuddered. His damage control display lit up in amber. A fuel system caution. A hydraulic pressure anomaly in the left 11 actuator. Not catastrophic. The aircraft still flying. The weapon weapons were still armed. The mission was still executable. The pilot ran through his emergency procedures in 11 seconds, while continuing to climb and assess the threat picture, because in the environment he was operating in, stopping to think carefully about one problem meant dying from another. The Israeli portion of the strike package was already executing its assigned role 80 kilometers to the west. 4 F-15Es carrying a combination of Rampage supersonic standoff missiles and ROS-KS bunker-penetrating weapons been orbiting at medium altitude outside Iranian radar coverage for 20 minutes, waiting for their release cue. The Rampage missiles were already in flight, 16 of them threading the Iranian air defense network along carefully mapped corridors where the American electronic warfare architecture had suppressed radar coverage. Their targets were the air defense nodes surrounding the primary compound, the Tor M2 batteries, and radar installations that had been mapped over 14 months of collection. The Israelis were not attempting to destroy Iranian air defense comprehensive. That would require a campaign lasting weeks. They were cutting a corridor, a temporary gap through which the precision munitions targeting the underground facility could be delivered without intercept. It was a surgical operation requiring the coordination of dozens of aircraft, hundreds of munitions, and a command architecture that had been rehearsed for 3 months. At 0617, pilot reached his release altitude of 200 meters. His left L11 was responding sluggishly but within acceptable parameters. The fuel system caution had stabilized. He was leaking slightly but had sufficient fuel to complete the mission and recover to a tanker. His weapons bay doors opened. 2 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, each weighing 13,600 kilograms, hung in the dark of his weapons bay for 1.3 seconds before the ejectors fired, and they fell away into the morning air over Iran. He was already rolling inverted, his nose dropping toward the desert floor, trading altitude for the speed that would carry him back toward the tanker and the Abraham Lincoln and the world where people made decisions about missions like this from air-conditioned rooms. The GBU-57 was not a precision weapon in the conventional sense. It was the largest airdrop bomb in the American inventory, designed specifically to destroy facilities that had been hardened beyond the capability of smaller munitions. Its guidance package used GPS and inertial navigation, and over the Natanz corridor, the GPS environment was heavily jammed by Iranian electronic warfare systems that had been running continuously for months. The bomb's inertial navigation systems took over, doing the same mathematical integration of acceleration and velocity that the AASM guidance packages had done over Ukraine, calculating position from physics rather than satellites. The accuracy degradation was acceptable for weapons of this size. A 10-meter error on a weapon that destroyed everything within 40 meters was operationally irrelevant. The first GBU-57 in surface of the compound at 0618:43 local time, penetrating 24 meters of reinforced earth before its delayed action fuse initiated the warhead. The explosion was equivalent to 2,400 kilograms of high explosives detonating inside a confined space. The shockwave traveled through the rock and concrete at 3 kilometers per second, collapsing the first 2 underground levels of the facility and severing every support structure in the upper third of the complex. The second weapon arrived 1.2 seconds later, following the penetration channel created by the first, reaching a depth of 38 meters before detonation. The combined effect was the complete structural failure of a facility that Iranian engineers had designed to survive a nuclear near-miss. The ventilation system that Israeli satellites had tracked stopped producing thermal signatures at 0.1111. The pilot didn't see the impact. He was 35 kilometers west and descending fast, his damaged aircraft still flyable, but demanding his complete attention as he navigated toward the tanker track and out of Iranian airspace. His radio carried the mission assessment calls from the airborne command element orbiting over the Gulf. The language was controlled and professional, the clipped shorthand of people who had trained for this moment and were executing exactly as rehearsed. He heard the impact confirmation. He heard the secondary assessment. He heard the intelligence team's preliminary call that would take days to verify and would be publicly debated for years. But in that moment, in the gray morning light over the Gulf carried the weight of history. The target was assessed destroyed. What happened in the hours after the strike was a demonstration of American diplomatic and military dominance that was as carefully planned as the strike itself. The Abraham Lincoln strike group, joined by the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, which had been holding 200 kilometers south, moved to alert as Iranian naval and air forces began reacting. Iranian fast attack craft launched from Bandar Abbas. Iranian ballistic missiles were moved to elevated alert status at 3 known launch facilities. The IRGC's drone force, which had grown to an estimated 3,000 systems capable of reaching Israeli territory, was put on immediate launch readiness. For approximately 4 hours on the morning of February 2, 2026, the possibility of a regional war expanding into a full theater conflict was real and immediate and being managed in real time by people in Washington and Tel Aviv and aboard 2 carrier strike groups who had been gaming this exact scenario for 18 months. The American response to Iranian escalatory moves was a demonstration of force rather than an expansion of combat. B-2 Spirit bombers from Diego Garcia conducted visible flights toward Iranian airspace, turning back at the 12-mile limit but ensuring their presence was detected and tracked by Iranian radar operators. 2 Ohio-class guided missile submarines, their presence in the region, previously unacknowledged, surfaced briefly in the Strait of Hormuz in positions where Iranian maritime aircraft would observe them. The message was delivered without a single additional weapon being fired. The United States had the capability to continue this operation indefinitely. The escalation calculus that Iran's leadership was running in the hours after the strike to account for an adversary that had just demonstrated the ability to reach their most protected leadership infrastructure and the willingness to absorb the regional consequences of doing so. Iranian retaliation came, as American planners had anticipated, in a form calibrated to be visible without being suicidal. A salvo of 24 ballistic missiles was fired toward Israeli territory at 3:40 local time on February 2nd. The Arrow 3 system, operating in conjunction with American THAAD batteries positioned in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, intercepted 22 of them above the atmosphere. 2 missiles penetrated the layered defense and were engaged by Iron Dome and David Sling at lower altitude. Neither reached a populated area. Israeli casualties were 0. The American and Israeli defense architecture had performed exactly as designed, absorbing an Iranian escalatory response that was large enough for Tehran to claim a demonstration of resolve without triggering the full American military response that Iranian leadership understood would end the Islamic Republic as a governing structure. The pilot landed back aboard the Abraham Lincoln at 0847 local time, his aircraft trailing a thin mist of jet fuel from the shrapnel puncture in his aft fuselage section. The deck crew noted the damage with practiced efficiency and began the repair assessment before the pilot had finished his post-flight checks. He submitted his mission debrief to the intelligence team waiting in the ship's classified spaces and drank a cup of coffee in a room that smelled of aviation fuel and recycled air. When the debrief was complete, he walked back to his stateroom and lay down on his bunk and stared at the overhead, thought about the things that pilots think about after missions like this. He would be debriefed again by a different team in 48 hours. He would be debriefed a third time by people who would fly out to the ship specifically to talk to him about the new mission signature he had encountered. That debrief would generate a classified report that would change the electronic warfare update schedule for every F-35 in the American and Allied inventory. The mission's strategic consequences unfolded over the following days in ways that the planners had modeled but could not fully predict. The confirmed death of the supreme leader created an immediate succession crisis inside the Iranian government, a crisis that American and Israeli intelligence had assessed would divide the hardline and pragmatist factions, that could accelerate internal political change, or could consolidate power in the hands of IRGC commanders who had always seen the clerical leadership as an inefficient constraint on military action. Which outcome materialized would depend on factors that no amount of American intelligence capability could fully predict, because it would depend on decisions made by individuals inside a system that was now helpless and under existential pressure. The planners had accepted this uncertainty. The alternative, allowing a government with nuclear weapons ambitions and a demonstrated willingness to use proxy forces against American to continue operating behind a leadership that had proven resistant to every other form of pressure, had been assessed as the greater risk. What the mission had demonstrated with absolute clarity was the state of American dominance in 2026, the ability to coordinate a strike package of this complexity across distance, maintaining electronic warfare dominance in a heavily contested electromagnetic environment while adapting in real time to a previously unknown threat system, executing precision weapons delivery against a hardened underground facility through GPS, and managing the escalation response with enough and credibility to prevent regional war from expanding, represented a convergence of technology, intelligence, and training that no other military force could replicate. The Russians had learned in Ukraine that technological overmatch by an adversary with superior precision munitions and electronic warfare capability was an existential problem for conventional military forces. The Iranians had learned the same lesson on February 2, 2026, in a more direct and irreversible way. The pilot's damaged F-35 was repaired in 19 hours by the Lincoln's maintenance crews and returned to flight status. The new emission signature he had encountered was transmitted to NSA's signals intelligence database and matched against collection from 4 other platforms that had detected the same system from different angles, enough to fully characterize its parameters. A countermeasure was pushed to every American F-35 theater within 72 hours. The Iranians' passive detection innovation, which had taken years to develop and deploy, was countered within 3 days of its first operational employment. That asymmetry between the time required to develop a capability and the time required for the Americans to counter it was the fundamental mathematical reality of competing against an adversary that had invested more in electronic warfare research than any other nation in history and had built the architectural infrastructure to translate that research into operational countermeasures at a speed no other military could match. The bridge outside Natanz, or rather the hardened facility beneath it, would remain a restricted zone for months as Iranian engineers assessed whether anything could be salvaged from the collapsed underground complex. Signals intelligence indicated the answer was no. The GBU-57 penetrators had done precisely what they were designed to do, reaching depths that Iranian engineers had believed were protected by physics and geology. The American engineers who had designed those weapons understood physics and geology better than the Iranians had accounted for. American dominance was not accidental. It was the product of decades of investment, institutional knowledge, and the particular kind of focused technical problem-solving that emerged from an open society's defense research ecosystem, one that could draw on the full breadth of American scientific and engineering talent in ways that closed authoritarian systems could not replicate regardless of budget or intent. The pilot filed his final after-action report on February 5, 2026. It was 47 pages long. The section on the new Iranian passive detection system was 11 pages and would be read by every senior officer in the American air warfare community within a week. The section on flying through a drone-saturated threat environment at low altitude received 3 pages, because the American military had been what Ukraine had taught the world about drone warfare and had been adapting its doctrine and training accordingly, and the pilot's experience confirmed several things the doctrine writers had already suspected and added 2 things they had not anticipated: the American military's capacity for institutional learning, for absorbing lessons from conflicts it was not directly fighting and translating them into doctrine changes that improved the performance of forces in conflicts it was directly fighting, was itself a form of dominance, not technological dominance, something more durable than that, the dominance of an institution that had learned how to learn. On February 2, 2026, at 0619 local time, the thermal signature from the ventilation system of a hardened underground facility outside Natanz disappeared from Israeli satellite imagery. In the controlled professional language of the airborne unmanned element orbiting over the Gulf, the target was assessed destroyed. In the more expansive language of history, something had changed that morning that would take years to fully understand. American and Israeli military power had reached into the most protected place on Earth and done what it had set out to do. The supreme leader was reportedly attacked. The strikes had escalated the conflict to a threshold that the entire world was watching, and the pilot who had flown the first weapon over the target was already asleep in his bunk aboard the Abraham Lincoln, his coffee cup in the sink, his after-action notes on the desk beside him, and the sound of flight deck operations, a constant vibration through the steel overhead above his face.